Sometimes the most important moment in a man's life arrives on a single piece of paper. I was nobody in 1943. A kid from Far Rockaway with a decent mind for physics, sure, but decent minds were everywhere. Princeton had plenty of us. The war had started, and everyone who could think was being pulled into something bigger than themselves. I was working on problems, doing calculations, trying to be useful, but useful and recognized are different things. Then Robert Oppenheimer wrote a letter, one letter. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't long, but what happened after that letter changed everything. Not just for me, but for how I understood the way reputations are made in science. People think genius speaks for itself. It doesn't. Someone has to decide your voice matters first. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from. And if this story stays with you, you're welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. My father sold uniforms. Not the kind of work that impresses people at faculty dinners, but he had a mind that questioned everything. I remember being maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in our cramped apartment in Far Rockaway, watching him take apart a broken radio. His hands moved carefully, deliberately. He didn't just fix things. He wanted to understand why they stopped working in the first place. See this tube here? He'd say, holding up a vacuum tube to the light. Something inside got hot, too hot. Now it doesn't work. But why did it get hot? That question, why, became the rhythm of my childhood. Why does the ball roll downhill? Why does ice melt? Why do we see lightning before we hear thunder? My father didn't always have the answers, but he never pretended the questions were stupid. In Far Rockaway, in a Jewish neighborhood where most fathers worked with their hands or ran small shops, that kind of curiosity wasn't common. You worked, you provided, you didn't waste time asking why the world worked the way it did. But I couldn't help it. The questions just appeared in my head, one after another, and I had to find answers. In high school, I was the kid other students came to when they couldn't solve a math problem. I liked that, not because it made me feel superior, but because solving problems felt like taking things apart and seeing how they fit together, just like my father's radios. I met Arline Greenbaum when I was in high school. She lived a few blocks away. She was beautiful and smart and made me laugh, and I knew almost immediately that I wanted to marry her. But I was 17, heading to MIT, and marriage was something far away. Still, we wrote letters, long letters, the kind where you tell someone everything you're thinking, even the things that don't make sense yet. MIT was different from Far Rockaway in every way that mattered. The students there weren't just good at mathematics. They were ferocious about it. They competed. They showed off. They wanted everyone to know how smart they were. I learned quickly that being the smartest kid in Far Rockaway meant nothing in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There were dozens of us, maybe hundreds, all with the same local reputation we'd left behind. I studied physics because it felt like the deepest version of those why questions my father had taught me to ask. Why does light behave the way it does? Why do electrons orbit atoms in specific patterns? Why does matter have the properties it has? The mathematics was hard, sometimes brutal, but I liked that. It meant the answers weren't obvious. They required work. When I graduated from MIT in 1939, I had options. Several schools wanted me for graduate work. I chose Princeton. It was supposed to be the best place for theoretical physics. And my MIT professors told me that if I wanted to do serious work, that's where I needed to be. Princeton wasn't just different from Far Rockaway. It was different from MIT. At MIT, everyone was working hard, trying to prove themselves. At Princeton, there was this assumption that you'd already proven yourself just by being there. The graduate students dressed better. They spoke differently. Many of them came from families where going to Princeton wasn't a dream. It was expected. I showed up in cheap clothes with a New York accent and a directness that made some people uncomfortable. I didn't know the unspoken rules. I didn't know that you were supposed to be deferential to full professors in certain ways, that you weren't supposed to challenge their ideas too directly in seminars, that there was a whole social structure built on reputation and institutional prestige that had nothing to do with whether your equations were correct. My advisor was John Wheeler. He was younger than most of the senior faculty, maybe in his late 20s, And he had this way of thinking about physics that felt alive. Most professors presented physics as a finished thing, a cathedral you walked through admiring the architecture. Wheeler treated it like something still being built. He asked strange questions. He wondered about things that seemed settled. He wanted to know not just how things worked, but why they had to work that way and not some other way. We started working on absorber theory together. The idea was to understand how electromagnetic radiation worked, not by assuming that waves just propagate forward in time, but by considering both forward and backward time solutions to Maxwell's equations. It was weird, it was mathematically interesting, and it was absolutely not the kind of safe, conventional research topic that would impress the traditional physics establishment. I liked Wheeler enormously. He treated me like a colleague, not a student. We'd spend hours at the blackboard arguing about whether some mathematical approach made physical sense, whether we were solving a real problem or just playing with equations. He never pulled rank. If I thought his idea was wrong, I told him, and he'd either defend it or admit I had a point. But here's what I learned at Princeton that nobody tells you when you're applying to graduate school. Talent doesn't matter as much as you think it does. There were maybe 15 graduate students in physics while I was there. All of us were talented. All of us could solve hard problems. Some were probably more naturally gifted than I was. But talent, I realized, was the baseline. It was what got you in the door. What happened after that depended on something else entirely. It depended on whether someone with an established reputation decided you were worth paying attention to. I saw it happen over and over. A student would present their work at a seminar. If a senior professor thought it was interesting, other professors started thinking it was interesting. If that same student presented the same work and no senior professor reacted, the work just disappeared. It didn't matter if the equations were elegant or the ideas were novel. Without that initial stamp of recognition, you were just another graduate student with a thesis nobody would read. This bothered me more than I admitted at the time. I wanted to believe that good work spoke for itself, that if you solved an important problem in a clever way, people would notice. But that's not how it worked. People noticed what they were told to notice by people they already respected. By 1942, everything had changed anyway. The war had started. Pearl Harbor happened while I was still working on my thesis. Suddenly, physics wasn't just an intellectual pursuit. It was a tool. The government wanted physicists. They needed them for radar, for bombs, for projects nobody would talk about directly, but everyone knew were happening. I finished my thesis in early 1942. Wheeler had already left for war work. I was 24 years old with a Princeton PhD in theoretical physics, and I had no idea what that was worth. I started working on ballistics problems, calculating trajectories, doing the kind of applied mathematics that felt disconnected from the deeper questions I actually cared about. Arline was sick by then. She'd been sick for a while, but it was getting worse. The doctors thought it was tuberculosis. We'd gotten married anyway, against her parents' advice, against the advice of basically everyone who knew us. I loved her. That was the only logic that mattered to me. I was doing war work, visiting Arline in the hospital when I could, and trying to figure out what came next. I wasn't nobody, exactly. I had a Princeton degree. I had papers with Wheeler, but I also wasn't anybody. There were hundreds of young physicists just like me, all with degrees from good schools, all doing war calculations, all waiting to see what their lives would become after the war ended. Then in March of 1943, I received a letter. It was from J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'd never met him. I knew who he was, of course. Everyone in physics knew who Oppenheimer was. He was brilliant, charismatic, one of the leading theoretical physicists in the country. He'd been at Berkeley, building up one of the best physics programs in America. The letter was short, professional. He was assembling a team for a special project. Wheeler had recommended me. Would I be interested in discussing this further? I held that letter for a long time before I responded. I understood immediately what it meant, not just as an opportunity, but as a signal. Oppenheimer didn't know me. He'd never seen me work. He was trusting Wheeler's judgment, and Wheeler had chosen to put my name forward. That's how reputations are actually built. Not by being brilliant in isolation, but by being recognized by someone who already has the authority to decide whose brilliance matters. I wrote back and said yes. The meeting with Oppenheimer happened in a hotel room in New York. Not his office, not some formal university setting. A hotel room. That told me something right away about what kind of project this was. Secret enough that normal academic spaces weren't appropriate. He was younger than I expected. Early 40s, maybe. Thin, almost gaunt, with intense blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He smoked constantly. The room already smelled like old cigarettes when I arrived. Wheeler speaks highly of your work, he said after we'd shaken hands. No small talk. No warming up to the subject. The absorber theory. Unconventional approach. It works mathematically, I said. Whether it describes reality is a different question. He smiled at that. A quick, sharp smile. Most of physics is that question, isn't it? We have equations that work. We're never quite sure what they mean. He told me about the project in careful language. A new weapon, theoretical possibility based on recent work in nuclear physics, chain reactions, critical mass, enormous energy release. He didn't use the word bomb directly, but that's what he meant. Everyone in physics knew the theory by then. Splitting heavy atoms released energy. If you could make it happen fast enough, all at once, you'd have an explosion unlike anything that had existed before. We're building a laboratory, he said. Remote location, New Mexico. We'll have the best physicists in the country, maybe the world. The work is theoretical and experimental. We need people who can calculate fast, who can see problems before they become disasters, who can work under pressure. You need people who can think, I said. Yes. He lit another cigarette. But more than that, we need people who can think together. This isn't individual research. It's collaborative under impossible deadlines. Egos have to disappear. The work is what matters. I believed him when he said that. Though I'd learn later that egos never really disappear. They just find different ways to express themselves. There's another thing, I said. My wife is sick. Tuberculosis. She's in a hospital in New Jersey. I'd need to be able to visit her. Oppenheimer nodded. He didn't hesitate. We'll arrange it. There's a hospital in Albuquerque. We can have her transferred there. You can visit on weekends. That surprised me. I'd expected him to say the work was too important, that personal concerns had to wait, that this was war and everyone made sacrifices. Instead, he treated my marriage as something that mattered, something that could be accommodated within the larger project. I accepted his offer that day. The next few weeks were strange. I couldn't tell anyone where I was going or what I'd be doing. Not my parents, not our line, not directly. The government had me sign papers. They investigated my background. They wanted to know if I'd ever been a member of certain organizations, if I'd ever expressed certain political sympathies. I hadn't. My politics were simple. I liked solving problems, and I didn't like fascism. That seemed sufficient. Our line was transferred to the hospital in Albuquerque in early summer. I saw her before I left for Los Alamos. She was thinner than she'd been at our wedding. The disease was eating her from inside, slowly but steadily. She smiled when she saw me, though. She always smiled. So you're going to work on something secret, she said. Something important. Yes, good. You should do important work. You're smart enough for it. I held her hand. It felt light, almost fragile. I'll visit every weekend I can. I know you will. She squeezed my hand. Go do whatever they need you to do. I'll be here. The trip to Los Alamos was unlike anything I'd experienced. You took a train to Santa Fe, then a military car drove you up into the mountains. The road was barely a road. Dirt, rocks, sharp turns with drops on one side that made you understand how far you were from normal life. We climbed higher and higher. The air got thinner. The landscape turned into something from another planet. Dry, open, with mesas rising in the distance like flat-topped monuments. The laboratory itself sat on a mesa. It had been a boys' school before the government took it over. Now it was a compound. Fences, guard posts, military police checking identification. Inside, it was chaos. Buildings going up, equipment being installed, people arriving every day from different universities, different backgrounds, all being thrown together into this strange community that didn't quite exist yet. I was assigned a dormitory room. Small, basic, nothing like the apartments I'd had at Princeton. A bed, a desk, a small window looking out over the mesa. I unpacked my few belongings and reported to the technical area. That's where I met the others. Hans Bethe was there. He'd be leading the theoretical division. German-born, precise, with a mind that could hold enormous amounts of detail and organize it all into clear structures. He was older than me, already well established, the kind of physicist whose papers everyone read. Robert Serber was there, Oppenheimer's protege from Berkeley. He'd been involved in the early planning, understood the theory as well as anyone. Edward Teller was there, Hungarian, intense, obsessed with ideas about fusion reactions that went beyond what we were supposed to be working on. He wanted to build something bigger, more powerful, something that hadn't even been proven possible yet. And there were others, young physicists like me, mostly in their 20s and 30s, pulled from graduate schools and postdocs and junior positions. We'd all been chosen by someone. We'd all been recommended. Every person on that mesa was there because someone with authority had decided they were worth including. The first few days were orientation. Serber gave lectures on what they called the gadget, the physics of fission, how uranium and plutonium behaved, what critical mass meant, how fast the reaction had to happen to create an explosion rather than just a mess. It was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. We were trying to build something that had never existed, based on theories that had only been proven in tiny laboratory experiments. Beeth organized the theoretical division into groups. Each group had a specific problem to solve: hydrodynamics, neutron diffusion, implosion dynamics, efficiency calculations. I was assigned to Bethe's group, working on whatever calculations seemed most urgent at any given moment. The work was harder than anything I'd done at Princeton. Not intellectually harder, necessarily, but harder in its demands. We worked long hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The problems were never fully solved. You'd finish one calculation and discover it revealed 3 new questions. You'd solve those and find that your original assumptions were wrong, and you'd have to start over. But here's what struck me most in those first weeks. I was being listened to. When I had an idea about how to approach a calculation, Beeth would stop and consider it. When I suggested a different method for solving an integral, people would try it. When I pointed out that someone's result didn't make physical sense, they'd check their work rather than dismissing me. At Princeton, I'd been a graduate student. My ideas were interesting as student ideas, but they carried no weight. Here, at Los Alamos, my ideas were just ideas. They were evaluated on whether they were useful, not on who I was or where I'd come from. Oppenheimer created that environment. He moved between groups, asking questions, pushing people to explain their thinking, treating young physicists like me as colleagues rather than subordinates. When he listened to you, he really listened. His attention was complete. You felt like the thing you were saying was the most important thing in the world to him at that moment. That's a kind of recognition that changes you. It makes you think harder. It makes you care more about being right, about finding the real answer rather than the easy answer. I started to understand what his letter had really meant. It wasn't just an invitation to work on an important project. It was an invitation into a community where my work would matter, where my ideas would be taken seriously, where the hierarchies of academic physics were temporarily suspended in favor of solving an urgent problem. Every weekend, I drove down to Albuquerque to see Arline. The hospital was clean but depressing. All hospitals are depressing when someone you love is dying in them. She'd ask about my work, and I'd tell her what I could without breaking security. Mostly, I told her about the people, about the strange life we were building on top of a mesa in the middle of nowhere. "You sound happy," she said once. "I'm not happy. You're sick. I mean, about the work. You sound like you're doing something that matters." She was right. Despite everything, despite the long hours and the fear that we might fail, despite visiting my dying wife in a hospital hundreds of miles from anyone who knew us, I was doing the best work of my life. And people were noticing. The calculations never stopped. That's what I remember most about those months at Los Alamos. We'd solve one problem, and Bethe would arrive with another. The pressure wave from the explosion, the behavior of materials under extreme compression, the timing mechanisms. Every answer revealed gaps in our understanding. I developed a reputation quickly. Not for being the smartest person there, because I was no smartest person. Bethe knew more physics than I'd probably ever know. Teller had intuitions about nuclear reactions that bordered on supernatural. But I was fast. I could look at a complicated integral, see a shortcut, and have an answer while others were still setting up the problem. Speed mattered when you had deadlines measured in weeks, not years. Bethe started giving me the hardest calculations. The ones where the standard methods didn't work, where you had to invent something new just to get started. I liked that. It felt like those childhood hours taking apart radios, except now the radio was the fundamental structure of matter and the stakes were winning a war. But there was something else happening too. Something I didn't want to think about directly. Every weekend I drove to Albuquerque. And every weekend our line was a little bit worse. A little thinner. A little more tired. The doctors were trying different treatments. Tuberculosis in 1943 didn't have good treatments. You either got better on your own or you didn't. She wasn't getting better. We'd sit in her hospital room and I'd try to be present. But part of my mind was always back on the mesa, working through some calculation I'd left unfinished. I hated that about myself. Your wife is dying and you're thinking about neutron cross-sections. What kind of person does that? Tell me about the work, she'd say. And I'd tell her pieces of it. The safe pieces. The parts that wouldn't violate security but would give her something to think about besides being sick. Do you think it'll work? She asked once. The thing you're building? I don't know. The physics says it should. Whether we can actually build it is different. But you want it to work. I thought about that. Yes, we're at war. People are dying every day. If this ends it faster, then yes, I want it to work. She nodded. She understood that logic. Everyone understood that logic in 1943. The war wasn't abstract. It was real. It was everywhere. It was costing lives every single day. It continued. What we were doing at Los Alamos had a moral clarity to it. We were trying to stop the worst people in modern history from winning. Back at the laboratory, the pressure intensified. By late 1943, we understood the basic physics of fission bombs. But understanding and building are different things. The engineering problems were enormous. How do you machine plutonium when it's toxic and radioactive? How do you create uniform compression in an implosion design? How do you ensure the reaction happens fast enough to be an explosion rather than a fizzle? Oppenheimer held the whole project together. I watched him do it. He'd move between groups, absorbing information from each one, seeing connections that nobody else saw. He understood the chemistry, the metallurgy, the engineering, the physics. More importantly, he understood people. He knew when to push someone and when to back off. He knew how to make a room full of competitive, egotistical physicists work as a team. I saw how he did it with me. He'd stop by our group, listen to what we were working on, and then he'd ask a question. Not a challenge, just a question. Have you considered this angle? Or what would happen if we changed that assumption? And the question would open up a new way of thinking about the problem. That's leadership. Not telling people what to do, but helping them see what they haven't seen yet. There were arguments, of course. Teller was constantly trying to redirect resources toward his fusion ideas. He'd buttonhole people in hallways, explaining why we should be working on the super instead of these small fission bombs. Some people found him exhausting. I found him interesting but impractical. We had a mission. Build a fission bomb. Everything else was distraction. The theoretical division worked closely with the experimental groups. We'd calculate what should happen under certain conditions, and they'd try to create those conditions in the laboratory and measure the results. Sometimes our calculations matched the experiments. Sometimes they didn't, and we'd have to figure out what we'd gotten wrong. I started leading some of the calculation groups. Beth trusted me with that. I was maybe 25 years old, and I had a team of physicists working under my direction, checking my methods, extending my results. That had never happened at Princeton. At Princeton, I was Wheeler's student. Here, I was becoming something else, someone whose judgment other people relied on. One evening, Oppenheimer called me to his office. It was late, after dinner. Most people had gone back to their dormitories, but Oppenheimer often worked past midnight. I've been watching your work, he said. The methods you've developed for the efficiency calculations, they're elegant. They get the job done. More than that, you've seen shortcuts that save us weeks, maybe months. He leaned back in his chair. Wheeler was right about you. That sentence landed differently than I expected. Wheeler was right about you. Not you're talented or you're doing good work. Wheeler was right. The implication was clear. Oppenheimer had taken a risk inviting me based on Wheeler's recommendation. That risk had paid off. My reputation was being built, piece by piece, through work that other people with established reputations validated and amplified. I want you to take on more responsibility, he continued, coordinating between theoretical and experimental groups, making sure calculations get done when they need to get done. You're good at seeing what matters and what doesn't. I accepted. How could I not? But I also understood what was happening. I was being incorporated into the structure of authority at Los Alamos. Not just doing good work, but becoming someone whose work shaped what others did. The months blurred together. Fall 1943 into winter. Winter into spring of 1944. The calculations got more refined. The engineering got more sophisticated. We were actually going to build this thing. The gadget. The bomb. Whatever euphemism you wanted to use for a weapon that could destroy an entire city. Did I think about that? Yes. Late at night, lying in my narrow dormitory bed, I thought about it. We were building something that would kill thousands of people instantly. Maybe tens of thousands. Maybe more. The physics didn't care about the morality. The physics just described what would happen when you suddenly released that much energy in a small space. But then I'd remember why we were doing it. The war. The concentration camps we were starting to hear about. The millions already dead. The calculation was simple. If this weapon ended the war faster, it would save more lives than it cost. That's what I told myself. That's what we all told ourselves. In June of 1944, our line got worse. Much worse. The hospital called me at the laboratory. I drove down immediately. She was conscious, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and labored. The tuberculosis had spread to most of her lungs. There wasn't much time. I stayed with her for 3 days. I held her hand. I told her I loved her. I told her about the mountains, about the work, about anything I could think of that might comfort her. She couldn't talk much by then, but she'd squeeze my hand to let me know she heard me. She died on the 16th of June, 1944. She was 25 years old. I drove back to Los Alamos the same day. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay in that hospital room with her body. I couldn't face her parents. I couldn't face the reality of what had just happened. So I drove up the mountain, back to the mesa, back to the calculations. B found me in the technical area that evening. I was at a blackboard, working through a problem we'd been stuck on. He looked at me for a long moment. I heard about your wife, he said quietly. I'm very sorry. Thank you. You don't have to be here. You can take time. I'd rather work. He nodded. He understood. Maybe he didn't approve, but he understood. Work was the only thing that made sense right then. Everything else was grief and emptiness and questions I couldn't answer. But the mathematics was still true. The physics still worked. The calculations still needed to be done. I worked harder after that. Longer hours, more problems. I volunteered for everything. If there was a calculation nobody else wanted to do, I'd do it. If there was a problem that seemed impossible, I'd try anyway. The other physicists noticed. Some of them worried about me. Some of them just appreciated having someone willing to take on extra work. Oppenheimer noticed too. He didn't say much, but he started giving me more responsibility, more coordination tasks, more leadership roles. It wasn't pity. It was recognition that I was capable of handling it. that I could be trusted with important parts of the project. By the end of 1944, I wasn't a junior physicist anymore. I was one of the key people in the theoretical division. My methods were being used by other groups. My results were being incorporated into the overall design. When there were meetings about critical problems, I was in the room. That transformation happened in less than 2 years, from nobody to somebody. From a Princeton graduate student nobody had heard of to a physicist whose work shaped the Manhattan Project. And it started with a letter. One letter from Robert Oppenheimer, written because John Wheeler had mentioned my name. That's what I kept coming back to. The talent was always there. The ability to do this work was always in me. But none of it mattered until someone with authority decided to recognize it. Wheeler vouched for me to Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer gave me the opportunity. Beth trusted me with important calculations. Each act of recognition built on the previous one, creating a reputation that then sustained itself. Other young physicists at Los Alamos were just as talented. Some were more talented, but if they hadn't been recommended by the right people, if they hadn't been given the right opportunities at the right moments, their talent wouldn't have mattered. They'd still be doing good work in obscurity. This bothered me. It still bothers me. Science is supposed to be objective. The truth is the truth, regardless of who discovers it. But the process of science is entirely human, entirely dependent on these networks of recognition and authority. Your brilliance only matters if someone with existing authority decides it matters. I was lucky. Wheeler decided I mattered. Oppenheimer agreed. Beth confirmed it. And my reputation was built on that foundation of other people's recognition, not on the intrinsic quality of my work alone.